On 3rd of May, the Centre for Chronic Illness and Aging at the University of Greenwich held a hybrid dissemination event called Living with Chronic Illness as We Age. It was partly funded by the British Society of Gerontology and supported by the Institute for Lifecourse Development, of which the Centre for Chronic Illness and Aging is part of. Around 35 attendees took part offline and online. The event started with introductions by Professor Rosanna Pacella, Director of the Institute for Lifecourse Development, welcoming the attendees and speakers, which included the lead of the Centre for Chronic Illness, Professor L.B.Dibley. Professor L.B.Dibley shared insights from her research on inflammatory bowel disease, or IBD.
And these both cause inflammation in your intestines. They cause pain, loss of appetite, fatigue, loose stools and urgency and frequency, the need to hurry to the toilet many times, and emotional.
Professor Dibley and her research team was one of the first to capture statistical evidence on the daily impacts of IBD, particularly the struggle with loss of bowel control, even when the disease is inactive. She further developed tools for clinicians and for patients, all which support better patient care. Professor Omo Ojo, Professor in Nutrition and Diabetes in the School of Health Sciences at the University of Greenwich, spoke about the different types of diabetes, the prevalence, diabetes symptoms and causes.
So in terms of the types of diabetes, there are three main types. There's type 1, where there's absolute cessation of insulin secretion. There's type 2, where there's a residual production of insulin and there's a resistance to its action. And then, of course, there's gestational diabetes, which occurs during the course of pregnancy.
Professor Ojo has carried out several randomized control trials, or RCTs in short, and meta-analysis to examine the effects of variations in the diet for patients with type 2 diabetes. Results showed that HbA1c levels, or another term for this would be glycated hemoglobin, in low carbohydrate diet decreased significantly by 8.5% compared to the control group, which had 4%. They further found that the long-term use of low glycemic index diet of Kerala cuisine has been found to promote weight loss, enhance insulin sensitivity, and reduce the cardiovascular risk. Yet, no significant differences were found between the low glycemic index diet and high glycemic index diets in relation to the total cholesterol in patients with type 2 diabetes. D.Hansjee, Senior Lecturer and Program Lead for Speech and Language Therapy, shared her expertise on living well with eating, drinking, swallowing difficulties. She demonstrated that swallowing is a complicated process and many swallowing difficulties increase with age.
Some strategies together in the way of a framework of P's. What can we be doing to be living well, maximizing quality of life as we get older when we're living with chronic disease?
She presented us with practical suggestions about what you or the team looking after you can do to facilitate the identification of swallowing difficulties as early as possible.
We want to be able to identify dysphagia as early on as possible, because that will allow us to sit with you and plan and future plan.
Professor S.Patchay, Associate Professor for Movement and Cognition Research in the School of Human Sciences at the University of Greenwich, presented the prevalence of falls when we age and the consequences of falls.
And assessment of gait initiation is very important because it can enable clinicians, but researchers at the same time, to identify and diagnose disturbances in the locomotor system. That is the way we start walking and the way we carry on with our rhythmic locomotion. And this is very important because a good understanding of that may enable us to understand what can lead to falls, and we can pinpoint some predictors of falls.
He showed that gait initiation is a highly complex process between our brain activity and muscle activity involving the stepping foot and stance foot. Measuring the vertical ground reaction forces during experiments showed that reduced peak amplitude of vertical ground reaction forces could be a good predictor for risk of falls. Dr. Kafui, Adjaye-Gbewonyo, Senior Lecturer in Public Health at the School of Human Sciences, presented on the risk of cardiovascular diseases among 40 to 80-year-olds in England. Cardiovascular diseases is among the leading causes of death globally, and with the S.Patchay research, she aims to identify and compare the population trends and risks in England and South Africa from 1998 to 2017.
So how do we define people's risk for cardiovascular disease? One of the risk scores we're using is developed by the World Health Organization, and the latest version is from 2019. There's another version that doesn't require any lab measurement. So that's based on your age, your sex, your blood pressure, so the systolic blood pressure, whether you smoke or not, and then your body mass index, which is a measure of overweight and obesity. So it looks at your weight compared to your height.
Her preliminary findings show that cardiovascular diseases risk decreased for men and women in England in all age groups, except for younger men aged 40 to 49, where it remained fairly flat. Interventions to reduce smoking, blood pressure, and weight, especially by targeting men and starting at young ages, may help to reduce gender disparities in CVD risk. Dr. Marianne Markowski, Research Fellow at the Institute for Lifecourse Development, spoke about the importance to involve service users in research and knowledge exchange at different stages of the knowledge production cycle. Knowledge exchange is a flexible opportunity to involve more people with lived experience, service users and service providers in research and projects in novel ways.
So I had experience of doing research with people who have dementia and also are not mobile. So again, lots of challenges. One of the challenges when I was here, I thought like, okay, I'll bring some forms along and they can fill them in afterwards when they have tried it out. I didn't realize how difficult it was them to just fill a form because they need their classes. I had a trailer or just didn't want to write. So scrap the form bit when you're in places with very vulnerable older people, but be open for having conversations. This is a project recently which I did, which was a knowledge exchange project. Very enjoyable. It was a somatic co-creation, so we did it based on movement, and with the movement we combined other activities, which was very empowering for everybody who took part. And I took part as sort of a participant, and I have to admit it was very, very transformative because it really brought home how important it is to let the body talk as well, not just your mouth and your, the written word, but actually collect information from people from more sources than others.
The attendees asked questions, and their questions were usually centered around the specifics for each chronic illness. For example, one attendee asked, what can be done to reduce the risk of IBD developing? The answer is, it is an autoimmune condition, so nothing can be done to change an individual's potential for it to develop. But smoking and eating highly processed foods may increase the likelihood that it will develop in those where that potential exists. Another attendee asked for more top tips for managing swallowing difficulties. And the answer was the best way of addressing swallowing difficulties are positioning and good mouth care. Professor Dibley summarized succinctly at the end of the day what we had learned. The treatment of chronic illness is very important, yet lifestyle influences and environmental factors play an immense role in living well with chronic illness, and that we should keep moving our bodies as much as we can and as long as we possibly can.